We are going to bring out a few panelists here and have a little bit of a conversation about the differences between Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois. Obviously, a lot of folks have talked about the differences between the states lately, so we figured let's get some economists who really know their stuff, and let's just have a frank conversation. So I'm going to welcome them up onto the stage. Our first panelist with us here today is Noah Williams. He's the director at the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy at UW-Madison. We also have Orphe Divounguy, the chief economist at the Illinois Policy Institute. And then we also have John Phelan, an economist with the Center of the American Experiment in Minnesota. So please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. So I guess we'll just kind of kick things off a little bit here, allow each of you to introduce yourselves, and obviously we have one from each state, so maybe just a little brief introduction, what's happening in your state and with the policies that are going on, and what's the impact on its economy.
Sure. My name is Noah Williams. I'm a professor of economics here at UW-Madison and the director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy, which is a relatively new policy and research institute that we started up about a year ago, focusing on state-level economic and policy issues. I think as you saw from the introductory video, Wisconsin has, the economy is really in probably the best shape that it's been in a generation. I grew up in Wisconsin, moved back here 10 years ago, and let me just say this has been a very exciting time to be studying the Wisconsin economy, to see the dramatic changes which have come about, and we'll go into more detail on some of the particular policies which have contributed to those.
So, Orphe?
So my name is Orphe Divounguy. I'm the chief economist at the Illinois Policy Institute. I've lived in Illinois for about a year and a half, and I was surprised to see how one-party control has ruined the state. So we'll talk a little bit more about the policies that we've looked at. It's amazing to me that a state with a relatively young population and highly skilled population is struggling so much. Illinois has had 4 consecutive years of declining population, and so we'll go into the details.
John?
My name's John Phelan. I'm economist at the Center of the American Experiment. We're a think tank based in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I've lived there now since early 2017. And one of the things that we try to do there is, as I'm sure you'll know, for big government economic policies, Minnesota's the poster boy. People always say, higher taxes, look at Minnesota, it's working great there. Which is an interesting thing, nobody ever says, yes, look at Illinois. So we've got the two things here. And one of the things that we try to do is to actually examine, go deep into the data and look and see exactly what the situation in Minnesota's economy really is.
So I think, John and Noah, I'm going to start with the two of you because here in Wisconsin, we definitely see the comparison between Minnesota and the Badger State quite a bit. A lot of times it's folks saying that Minnesota's economy is vastly greater than the Wisconsin economy. And John, when we were talking, that doesn't seem to be true. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. If you look at, there was a report that came out a little while ago, you may have seen it, from the Economic Policy Institute. And what this paper did is it looked at economic data from Minnesota and Wisconsin since Mark Dayton became governor in Minnesota and Scott Walker became governor here. And they said that on every single measure, the Minnesota economy had outperformed Wisconsin's. Now, I was slightly surprised when I saw this paper because if you say to me, how are you going to compare these two states, first thing I look at is GDP. And I found that GDP was covered in this report by one paragraph, somewhere tucked quite far at the back, like page 19 or something. It's one of the few paragraphs actually without an accompanying chart. So when I went and downloaded the GDP data myself from the BEA and looked at quarterly data, because that allowed me to pinch out, the 3 months in Q4 2010 before the two men took office, and looked at growth between then and this was Q4 2017, was the most recently available at the time. Wisconsin's economy had actually grown faster than Minnesota's over that time period. And if you look at unemployment, for example, I think in December 2010, the unemployment rate here was 8.1%, and it was 7.1% in Minnesota. And by early this year, Wisconsin actually had a lower unemployment rate than Minnesota. So over that time, you'd seen unemployment fall from a higher level to a lower level. So it was a greater percentage point decrease in unemployment in Wisconsin compared to Minnesota. And another thing that I'd say is that to say that you can compare these two states exactly, it's just not true. There's an awful lot of things that are different between the two. And when you look at the border counties, you can freeze a lot of these things out. And if you look at the border counties of Wisconsin and Minnesota, you'll see that actually, in recent years, personal income growth has been faster in the Wisconsin counties than it has in the Minnesota counties. And interestingly, when you look at unemployment data, before 2014, in the Wisconsin counties, the unemployment rate was higher, and in the Minnesota counties, it was lower. After 2014, when Minnesota started to monkey around with its minimum wage laws and to raise its minimum wages, that's reversed. And in the Minnesota counties, the unemployment rate now is higher than it is in the Wisconsin counties.
Now, Noah, you did a little bit of research on the minimum wage, kind of looking between the two states. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so just a little bit more broadly speaking, people like to look at differences between the two states and assign everything to policy. And of course, everybody knows there's a lot more going on which affects the state economies than just policy. So to really isolate policy effects, you have to look at where would a policy have the biggest bite. And for instance, I looked at, in this study, looking at the minimum wage, which in Minnesota has gone up by roughly 50% over the last 4 years. You look at what sectors are most affected by the minimum wage, which parts of the labor market. It's young workers, and it's relatively low-skilled workers. Relatively low-skilled workers tend to be concentrated in retail and also in fast food employment, so-called limited service restaurants. So what I did was compare Minnesota, which has had this big increase in the minimum wage, with Wisconsin, where the minimum wage has been constant. And you'd see just what you would expect in a competitive environment. If you're increasing artificially the wages for low-skilled workers, what do we expect to see? We expect to see less employment, particularly for these sectors which are most affected. So we saw, comparing Minnesota and Wisconsin, we saw a 5% reduction in the employment for limited service or fast food restaurants since the minimum wage was stepped up. We also saw among young workers, people under the age of 25, in Wisconsin, there'd been a 10% increase. In Minnesota, there'd been a 9% fall over that same span. So presumably, this minimum wage policy was geared towards providing more income for people working lower wage jobs, but it actually ended up pricing a lot of them out of the labor market.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about Wisconsin and Minnesota, but I do want to bring in Orfe here. We were talking backstage a little bit about business growth between the three different states, and we're obviously here today to talk about Wisconsin's business climate, kind of take an annual checkup on where we're at, and business growth is obviously a huge part of that. You were saying that Illinois not doing so well on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Wisconsin, what we've seen in the data is that Wisconsin is creating net new business creation in Wisconsin's 10 times that of Illinois, 2.5 times that of Minnesota, and it's 43% higher than the national average. So you're creating a very competitive environment in Wisconsin, and I wonder how this is possible, right? So policy does play a huge role, right? And the reason why I think policy plays a huge role is that traditionally societies invest to provide new housing for young families and to provide equipment for workers. And when you look at the Wisconsin population, you have this big demographic change. You have an older population relative to neighbor states, right? Illinois and Minnesota, and even relative to the US average. And yet, you're actually producing more stuff in Wisconsin than other states. And I find that absolutely fascinating.
Now, one of the things that might be driving some of that business growth and probably job growth here in Wisconsin is that we have the manufacturing and agricultural tax credit. Noah, I know you've done a lot of research on this, something that basically eliminates the tax burden for businesses that are in agriculture or basically make things. Obviously, we have the coolest thing made in Wisconsin going to be announced later. Folks are taking advantage of that. How does that tax credit help to move the economy forward?
Yes, well, I think we'll also hear later from site selectors, and certainly it's something which has been mentioned as an important draw for businesses choosing to locate in the state. But to try to get a measure of the impact of this manufacturing and ag tax credit, the MAC, I actually looked at border counties, similar to what John was talking about, looked at the difference in manufacturing employment on either side of a border. So those counties on the Wisconsin side and those counties just over the border, looked at Minnesota, Illinois, but also upper Michigan and Iowa down in the corner as well. And what I found was that after the manufacturing and ag credit was introduced, it was phased in over time, so the impact grew over time. We see a real divergence in the growth rates between counties on either side of the border. There'd been, coming out of the recession, there'd been an overall growth in manufacturing in the U.S., but essentially on the non-Wisconsin side, that really flattened out, while Wisconsin continued to see an increase. And so that gap opened up. And doing a statistical analysis then, trying to account for some of the other differences between these two counties, between the counties on either side of the border, I tried to parse out this effect. And it turned out that when I wrote the study, which was about a year ago, we could assign roughly 20,000 manufacturing jobs cumulatively to the manufacturing and ag tax credit. Since that time, manufacturing has continued to increase and increase more rapidly in Wisconsin than on counties on the other side of the border, so that number's gone up even more. But in addition to these manufacturing jobs, it's not just that we're creating manufacturing jobs, but if a manufacturing plant opens up, that brings a whole host of supporting suppliers, supporting industries, supporting businesses. So from those 20,000 jobs which we could assign to this manufacturing and ag tax credit, that translated into 40,000 non-manufacturing jobs. So cumulatively, we're talking about a relatively substantial, roughly 5% increase in the relevant employment base, which is largely due to the fact that we're lessening the costs on employers, providing incentives for employers to invest and to grow their businesses in Wisconsin.
Now, John and Orphe, I think I want to get an outsider's look at Wisconsin a little bit, obviously coming from Illinois and Minnesota. There's certainly a lot of different policies going on in both of your states. But from an outsider looking into Wisconsin, both of us had conversations before today, and you talked a little bit about some of the specific things you see in Wisconsin that you look to and say, hey, why aren't we doing that in Minnesota or Illinois? So, John, I'll start with you. If you can kind of talk about when you look to Wisconsin, what are the things that you see that are obviously helping to drive our economy?
Well, one thing that I do think has been a help is the Act 10 thing, because one of the things that we have to keep in mind is productivity growth and labor productivity, and this is something we might talk about a little bit more. But for one of the big parts of that is education. You want an educated labor force. And Act 10, I think, when you look at the research, and there's a new paper out from the NBER about this, it's actually led to improved academic outcomes in Wisconsin, and it's led to a more efficient allocation of teaching labor in the labor market for teachers. So I think those are positive things. Also, I would say that any tax cuts that you have, those are a good thing. In Minnesota, we are one of the most heavily taxed states in America. And you do see that in the data. You see we lose people in every age category. Under 26-year-olds are the second biggest net loss in recent years. It's not just elderly people moving out to Nevada or somewhere. And we see we're actually losing people in every income category above a relatively modest $25,000 a year. So we're not talking about the rich fleeing Minnesota either. Even middle-class people they've had enough and they're getting out. So to the extent that you have tax cuts, I would say that is definitely something that we would look at and think, wish we had some of that.
And Orfe?
Yeah, I think Act 10 had it was a huge deal for the Wisconsin economy. If you look at Illinois, one of the biggest problems with the state is its pension crisis. You have these very complex collective bargaining contracts, and you have pension costs that are rising so fast in Illinois that now pension costs make up 25% of all state expenditures. And so in order to avoid pensions crowding out the delivery of services, police and fire, school spending, and other types of public investments, what the Democrat-controlled legislature has done is they've opted to raise taxes time and time again. And the result is, we see it. What we've seen is 4 consecutive years of declining population growth. So you have your population's declining, largely driven by outmigration of a working age population, a skilled working age population. And so the effect has been disastrous. If you look at growth in output per worker in Illinois compared to the national average, or even compared to Minnesota and Wisconsin, it's fallen a lot. It's fallen tremendously. You cannot grow an economy if you're losing your skilled workers, right? And so that's been a problem. They'll keep saying tax policy doesn't matter. We have a gubernatorial election this year, as you guys do in Wisconsin. And the Democrat is promising anywhere between $13 billion to $18 billion in additional spending. What this extra spending actually means is another tax increase. And so we're gearing ourselves for that. So Act 10 has been tremendous. Lowering the cost of government in Wisconsin has been a good thing. It gave investors some confidence that there wouldn't be a massive capital levy in the future, and that's good for growth.
I was saying, I think sitting here today, I think Illinois has seen their credit rating drop at the same time that Wisconsin has seen their credit rating increase. And so obviously Illinois is going in one direction. I do want to talk about the folks who are fleeing Illinois, actually. I'm one of those people. I grew up in the Chicago area and now live in Wisconsin happily. We'll try and get you guys to come into Wisconsin too. We need more workers here. So, but talking about Illinois, people are fleeing the state. I mean, what's the long-term economic plan in Illinois? I mean, clearly if people keep leaving, that's not good for you.
Right. If you listen to politicians, there's no plan, right? So no one wants to even address the worst pension crisis in the nation in political debates, right? No one's talking about pension reform in Illinois. It's going to be more of the same. We expect the Democrat probably to win in the fall. And it's going to be more of the same, and we're gearing up for another tax increase. And of course, when you're an investor and you look at the policies that are enacting and you look at the rising cost of pensions in Illinois and the certainty almost that you're going to have to pay and the likelihood of your investment returning anything decreasing, you choose another state. Fiscal policy in Illinois has made the state less competitive. And unfortunately, I don't see things changing anytime soon.
And no, a lot of those people are moving to Wisconsin from Illinois.
That's right.
Obviously, a different long-term economic outlook here based on the current economy and the current policies we have.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely the case. So I was just thinking back, the video prompted me to think about what were conditions like when I moved here. Right, so I moved here in 2008. My family's from the state. I have my 5 members of my immediate family. Our family unemployment rate was 60%. Right, so my mother, my brother, and my sister were all unemployed. Since that time, again, we've seen unemployment rates fall. It's been below 3% for going on 6 months now. But looking forward, we actually don't even see any reasons for slowdown with this. We've seen continued investments in the state. We've seen increases in labor force participation. I mean, I think as many of you know, one of the biggest problems we face right now is just the shortage of available workers. Right, so we've seen people who had been on the sidelines in the recession and in the slow recovery come back to the labor market more recently, and we're looking at expanding opportunities to people who are not even traditionally part of the labor market. So kind of along all these dimensions, there's vast opportunity for growth, and I think the outlook is very strong going forward.
So we've kind of talked about Illinois and Wisconsin. Now we're going to flip it back to the Minnesota and Wisconsin. Illinois, I think, is in a little bit worse of a situation than maybe Minnesota. But as we talked about at the beginning, a lot of people look to Minnesota maybe as like that progressive bastion of that. That's what we should be doing. Is everything that they're saying? I know you talked about it a little bit, but can you go in a little bit more detail about what the economy actually looks like in Minnesota?
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. People in Minnesota, they have this idea that they have some kind of cutting-edge tech, high productivity economy. If you drive into the Twin Cities, you'll go past a 3M head office, and people tend to think that that's what their economy is. In actual fact, Minnesota does have very good per capita numbers in terms of per capita GDP, per capita personal income. But when you look at their per worker numbers, they actually lag the national average. Minnesota's labor force is not a productive labor force. If you look at GDP per worker, GDP per hour worked, we lag the national average on all these numbers. Now, that's not a good thing, because the purpose of economic growth, or what you want to see, is not an increase in work. You don't want to see an increase in inputs. You want to see an increase in outputs. That's why they call it economic growth. And so being a kind of labor-intensive economy, as Minnesota is, in a lot of respects, that's not really what you want. We calculated that if Minnesota's workers were as productive as the average American worker, then every Minnesotan would be $5,000 a year better off. Think of a family of 4, that's $20,000 a year. That's not bad. And so you start to see actually that an awful lot of what looks great for Minnesota, these per capita numbers, once you look behind those, they don't look that good. And why do they have these numbers? Well, they have these numbers because we lag the national average on capital per worker. We lag the national average on new business as a share of all businesses. We lag the national average in terms of venture capital per worker. You tell people in Minnesota this and they're stunned. Because they think that their economy is composed of people, developing apps in northeast Minneapolis. But it's not. Their economy is very labor intensive. And for economic growth, that's not good. And when you look at it, it's policy that drives a lot of this. We have these incredibly high tax rates, some of the highest in the country in corporate tax and personal tax, and that impacts, the academic evidence shows that impacts all of these things that we lag the national average on and that drive our low labor productivity.
And how does that productivity per worker in Minnesota compare to the productivity of Wisconsin?
I'd like to pass it over to Noah, actually. I've done a lot more work on the Minnesota side than the Wisconsin side. But we were talking earlier on, actually, that in recent years, there has been a decline in labor force productivity generally, and it's actually a phenomenon you see across the Western world. It's a bit of a mystery. But one thing that you'll see, and Orphe might talk about this in more detail, is that Wisconsin's economy is actually kind of has an older profile. Mm-hmm. And one thing that you have is as older people drop out of the labor force, they take with them all the skills that they've learned, tacit knowledge and things like that, things that you can't learn from a book. And in the meantime, what do you have coming into the labor force to replace these people? You have younger people who are coming out of universities having done 4 years of something particularly useful? I don't know. And it's easy to make that kind of joke, but there's a lot of truth in it, which is perhaps why. And so I think we talked about this earlier. Wisconsin has actually seen that labor force that labor productivity decline less than elsewhere in the country, less than in Minnesota. And I think part of that actually is because they have this older age profile of their workforce, which has this embedded productivity, thanks to experience and learning.
So I'll kind of change the question a little bit to, let's talk about that productivity, but also Wisconsin's labor force participation rate is much higher than most of the rest of the country. What does that mean for Wisconsin?
In simple terms, it just means there's more people working. Now, so nationwide, a big part of the reduction in the unemployment rate after the recession was actually people just leaving the labor force. So this happened kind of at both ends of the age spectrum. It was people taking early retirements, but it was also this phenomenon of younger workers moving back in with their parents, not getting a foothold in the labor market. There was kind of the rise of the home video game culture. which really sapped the vitality of the labor market. That's abated a little bit nationwide, but what we saw in Wisconsin is we did see somewhat of a reduction, but we didn't see anything like what happened nationwide. And since that time, it's actually gone up. So labor force participation rates have hovered just below 70%, 68, 69%, which is a good 5 to 6 points above the national average for a long time. So that means not only are people engaged in Wisconsin, but they have more of a stake in their communities and in their economies. We look at all measures of kind of social pathologies. They're all very correlated with participation in the labor market. All right, so you look at teen or unwed pregnancies. You look at measures of opioid addiction and so on. Basically, all measures of kind of despair are highly correlated with whether people are in the labor market. So having a higher labor force participation rate means that we're suffering from less of those pathologies, in addition to having a more productive economy.
Now, one of the things that, speaking of the labor force, one of the issues that I'm sure every single business owner and person who works in Wisconsin here that they're facing is the workforce shortage. I know you've talked about that a lot over the past year. It seems to be really prevalent in Wisconsin and nationwide as well. What is it that do you guys think, and I'll let each of you answer this, that drives people to a state? I mean, what is it that you're seeing in the data that shows people are moving from one state to another? John, I'll start with you, and we'll come back this way.
Well, there's a lot of research on this, and I think you could say that there's a fair consensus that people move for opportunity, for the most part, and people will move where the opportunities are. And as I say, Minnesota has been losing people on net since 2000. Because for a long time we've had a tax environment that has negatively impacted our economic growth, and that has impacted negatively on the opportunities that people see. Interestingly, I would say we did have last year, according to the Census Bureau, a net increase in population for the first time this century, and people who support blue state policies were cock-a-hoop about this. And they said, this proves that all this is incredibly popular. But we spoke to the state demographer who said, well, actually, this is people moving here from Chicago. No offense. But, and when you actually look at the IRS data, we do see that, as I said earlier, we lose people in every income category over $25,000 a year. We actually gain people in the income categories below that. Now, if you think that pay is a kind of reasonably crude proxy for productivity, what that shows is that Minnesota is losing productive workers and gaining unproductive workers or less productive workers. And that's not good. That's not good for our economy. And I'm sure that you'll see a similar thing in other states that have our kind of profile. And like I say, the data on taxes and interstate migration is, I would say, fairly conclusive on that.
So I'm going to, again, switch the question a little bit. I mean, obviously, you can talk a little bit about why people are going to states, but why are people fleeing states, too? So what states are folks leaving, and where are they going?
I think Texas is a big pool for Illinoisans. You mentioned a little bit of Minnesota. I think something like 3 or 4% of our flows go to Minnesota. And so, people go because of opportunity. There's enough research that shows that. Whether it's labor or capital inputs, they'll go wherever they're most productive, where the return is the highest, and so that's why we're seeing a lot of people, move out of the state of Illinois. It's interesting you talk about labor productivity growth. When you look at most of the developed world, labor productivity growth has declined substantially. And economists have been focused on these cross-country comparisons. But very few actually look at the states. I think states are great laboratories for democracy. And, if you just look at Wisconsin, Wisconsin has had the smallest decline in labor productivity growth. They're doing something really, really well here in the state. And it probably has a lot to do with the tax climate, the competition, right? How competitive the business environment is here. And we're not seeing much of that in Illinois. And hopefully, eventually we'll learn. But you know what? I have to add that Illinois' loss is Wisconsin's gain.
Very true.
Thank you.
Quite a few folks coming from Illinois. So, no, I'll let you answer that same question.
Yeah, so I mean, I've talked a lot about the upside of Wisconsin. The fact is, we have also faced net outmigration for a number of years, nowhere on the scale of Illinois. But it has been an issue, and this has been an issue particularly kind of at the two ends of the age spectrum. So we've lost young workers, we've lost young college graduates on that, and we've lost older and wealthier people. What we tend to see is people call it a boomerang migration, so people move out when they're young, but then when it comes to more middle age and they want to raise a family, they move back to Wisconsin. Again, this has slowed down in recent years, similar to Minnesota. We actually had a net increase as well in the most recent year. So I think one of the sort of remaining issues, which we'll get into more later, is Wisconsin's made a lot of progress on a lot of fronts, but I think taxes, we look at the overall tax burden, tax progressivity, the overall business tax burden, it remains relatively high, and so that's still, I think, contributing to this loss of workers.
So we have about 5 or so minutes left here to kind of finish up this conversation, and I want to talk a little bit about what Wisconsin is doing well. We talked earlier how a lot of folks are looking to Wisconsin saying this is an example of maybe what we should be doing in other states. So if each of you could take about a minute or so and talk about another thing. I know we mentioned Act 10 before, but something else that you think Wisconsin is a national leader on, and then one thing that we haven't done yet that maybe we should start doing moving forward. So Noah, we'll start with you.
Well, I guess one thing which comes to mind, particularly in contrast to Illinois, would be our state pension system, right? So we have the only fully funded state pension system in the country. This is, it's essentially, I mean, the details of how this works, there's essentially a shared loss model, so that if we do hit hard times, that retirees actually take on some of that reduction as well. In addition to providing, income security for retirees, this has the benefit of reducing uncertainty and expected future taxes on businesses and workers in the state. So in addition to everything else, I think that's one really sort of outstanding in comparison to other states' policy, which Wisconsin has going for it. I think, again, the main outstanding issue, which remains to be done, we've seen a lot of bold reforms across really the state government, but particularly focused on economic policy. But I think the state tax code still remains uncompetitive. We're, depending on the rankings, somewhere in the 30s for business taxes. Manufacturing, and agriculture, we've seen the benefits of reducing the tax burden there. I think there's a lot of scope for broadening those benefits to extending them to other industries as well. We also have, a relatively high personal income tax burden, which particularly bites on those higher income individuals which do leave the state. Right, so when I was in Florida over spring break in Naples, ran into as many people from Wisconsin who've retired down there as people who native Floridians. So what we would like to see is those people stay here because not just are we losing the people, but we're losing everything which goes along with that, all of their philanthropy, all of the opportunities, and everything else. So I think the real outstanding policy issue going forward is changing the state tax code.
Yeah, absolutely. I think tax policy can do a lot to stimulate new investment. There's academics are talking about the decline in new investment, in developed economies. And I think that, one of the things that I think first, let me start with the good stuff, right? Act 10, we said Act 10 is a great thing that happened in the state because it reduced this uncertainty about the return on investment in the future due to a massive capital tax hike, right? So that's the good thing. The bad thing, or the things that we can improve on in Wisconsin, would be corporate taxes. I think your corporate taxes and corporate and franchise taxes are still quite high. I think that tax policy should aim to stimulate new investments, not just provide a windfall for current investors. And if we can do that, then you'll see Wisconsin grow even faster relative to its neighbors.
Yeah. And John?
The way I try to think about this is, if you think of it like a state macroeconomy, you've got various levers that you can use to grow it or to slow it down. We don't have monetary policy here. That's kind of exogenous. That's all decided by the Federal Reserve. So the policy levers that you have are tax and regulation. Now, in terms of taxes, you've made some progress on that, and I think that's something Minnesota could well learn from. And it's also something I think you need to push forward because, as you say, there is this erroneous idea that the St. Croix River is like the Berlin Wall or the 38th parallel or something like that. You've got a kind of communism on one side and casino capitalism or whatever on the other. That's just not true. I mean, if you drive along the I-94 bridge, it's absolutely not true. You've made progress, but there's still a long way to go. I hope we make as much progress as you have in terms of taxes, and also on the regulation side. Act 10 is a great thing, and I'd like us to see us enact something like that. We've got a very long way to go. You have a long way to go.
And then one last question. We're going to have Governor Scott Walker here on stage next. If each of you had 15 seconds as you run into him going backstage, what would be something you would tell him? John, we'll start with you, and we'll go back this way.
I would say keep doing what you've done. Actually. Keep on keeping on, as they say.
And Orfe?
Yeah, absolutely. The time to relent is, it's not now, right? We got to keep fighting the good fight. But very importantly, there's enough research that shows that corporate tax cuts have a huge positive effect on investment. And so, dealing with the corporate tax climate in the state of Wisconsin would be the number one thing I would be pushing for in a new term.
All right, and Noah?
Yeah, I guess I'll largely agree with Orphe. I think the main message would be finish the job. I mean, we've seen a real turnaround. We know that the governor has undertaken some bold reforms, but we'd like to see that continue to push forward. And we think reform of the state tax code would be the next big item to tackle.
All right, well, Noah, Orfe, and John, thank you very much for joining us today, and let's give these three a round of applause.